So, is there a separatist movement building in Russia that could potentially counter or even overthrow the Kremlin? We remember the mutiny by the Wagner group that led to Putin's personal Rosguardia units being deployed to shut it down, and the eventual assassination of Yevgeny Prigozhin, who was the head of Wagner group at the time. Now that Prigozhin is gone, is the idea of challenging or even overthrowing Putin still alive? Well, somewhat yes. There is a growing ecosystem of Russian citizens and minority groups taking up arms or more forcefully resisting Moscow, and Ukraine is taking advantage of this by amplifying their capabilities with intelligence support. At the same time, many of these groups are self forming in response to deep economic and social strain caused by Putin's war in Ukraine. Now, Putin shields himself from a lot of this. He hides behind a buffer zone in places like Moscow and St. Petersburg, so those cities are generally the last to feel the full weight of his policies or any policy in Russia that might screw over the Russian people. That does not mean the rest of the country is untouched, though. Rural regions and poorer republics are getting hit hardest, and some of their people are joining anti-Kremlin Russian units that fight on Ukraine's side, including the Freedom of Russia Legion and the Russian Volunteer Corps. We've also seen the emergence of the Siberian Battalion, drawing volunteers from Siberia and the far eastern regions of Russia that have been heavily targeted by shadow mobilizations and quiet recruitment drives. Now, these units were largely responsible for the cross-border raids into Belgorod, Kursk, and other regions, and it's challenging Moscow's image of total control of what's going on in Ukraine. But even though they do see some successes, they still operate from Ukrainian territory and rely on Ukrainian logistics, planning, and support. However, inside Russia and in the occupied territories, there is a steady pattern of sabotage against railways, enlistment offices, infrastructure, and military facilities. Small partisan cells with ideologies that run counter to the Kremlin do exist, including those that are anti-war, those that have ethnic problems with the Russian Federation, those that are nationalists to their own small region, but not so much to the broader Russian Federation as well, or those that are just rooted in older underground movements that still survive from the Soviet era. All of these seem to be active. In the North Caucasus, the Ingush Liberation Army and others claim repeated attacks on security forces and local collaborators. If you look at places like Chechnya, though it seems like Putin has it under control right now, it's largely because the Kadyrov family is lording over that whole region, and Putin continues to just pay Kadyrov off. If that were to fall apart, or if that tap gets turned off, Chechnya once again likely becomes a firestorm. And there is a documented rise in violence and efforts to build a broader Caucasus liberation narrative, much of it operating on its own tracks rather than as a simple proxy. Now, there is also a groundswell of activist movement around Yakutia, Russia, which is Russia's largest republic. Basically, it's a resource-rich republic, but it's treated as a colony, and Russia continues to do massive environmental damage there. They continue to underfund the communities, and they seem to be disproportionately affected by wartime losses because they are non-Slavic minorities. Those grievances feed into volunteer formations like the Siberian Battalion and into louder cultural and political pushback. In the past, harsh security crackdowns kept this sentiment quiet, but as resources and manpower are pulled towards Ukraine, we are seeing a loosening of control there. So exiled or marginalized local politicians are speaking more openly about futures that do not include Vladimir Putin and more visible regional self-assertion outside of the two main metro hubs of St. Petersburg and Moscow. Ukraine, along with Western intelligence services, are clearly attuned to this pressure inside Russia. They are supporting these volunteer units. They are spotlighting minority casualty rates in the war, and they are helping these units enable strikes and sabotage in Russia that strain the Russian security forces and expose the costs of the war at home. Now, you combine this with sanctions and Ukrainian-caused fuel shortages from refinery attacks, economic stagnation, mobilization fatigue, and increasingly heavy-handed repression from Putin. This is eroding the old assumption that ordinary Russians are just going to tune out the war, continue to drive on, this is just the way it goes, and they'll absorb the pain. It seems to be cracking. What we are seeing now is an early stage internal pressure system building. Real armed resistance is forming, real separatist sentiment, and real Ukrainian involvement. All of that being said, this is a localized and fragmented movement at this point. But it is growing inside of some of the most tightly controlled regions of the Russian Federation, and if it can coalesce, then the Kremlin really has to pay attention. Where it goes from here is uncertain, but even a small, persistent insurgent and separatist problem can become deeply corrosive for Putin over time.